And hello, everyone. Welcome to our little after show coda here. Hopefully, you went out and got yourself a cocktail or something, but either way, strap in. We're going to talk about board diversity. For the folks who watch the regular show, they already know how everybody thinks and feels about, the difference between meaningful engagement as opposed to the notion of outreach and the jargon of outreach. But we also know that things only get done when people put money into them. And right now, those people are going to be the large donors who are either sitting on a board or are the connection to the board. They are the ones that produce the grease that gets those gears going. So right now, if we're talking about board diversity, is it fair to assume that everybody thinks that things could be more diverse than they are now?
I think, yes, that is a safe assumption. It's hard to imagine how it could be less diverse. I mean, you could go a little bit less diverse than we have it now, but not too much.
I agree. It's a tough topic because I know that a lot of organizations are really working very hard, or at least they say they are working very hard to diversify their boards. If you ask any leader of any organization, they would say that's a high priority for them, right? Mm-hmm. What I wonder about is the power structure of a lot of boards and what it means to be on a board and what's required to be on it. Because so oftentimes we equate board membership with a certain level of donation as opposed to giving similar value to other types of contributions. What part of the city are you from? What demographic do you represent? Things like that. Like a lot of educational institutions, their boards oftentimes will say, we need to make sure that we have some degree of alumni engagement on our board, right? And in some institutions, maybe if you're Harvard or something, you could say, well, we probably have several alum who are billionaires. So we can double dip there by having an alum who also runs, is the CEO of or the founder of one of the top 50 richest companies in the history of the world. But there are a lot of other institutions that say we need to have someone who understands our culture or understands the culture we want to reach out to, and their ability or the requirement for them to be on the board is not attached to a financial obligation. So I think that's something that should probably be explored more as an avenue for bringing people in.
Yeah, and I'll throw another layer of complexity on top of this because especially as the budgets go up, this becomes exponentially more difficult, which an executive's job is to a large degree balancing the political and social dynamic that happens on the board level. And so, yes, Weston, what you mentioned, you can bring someone in on a board, an entirely different thing to actually give them power and to allow them something other than a single vote among however many votes there are. It's that old, we value your opinion until it becomes time to make the decision. Right. And then we're going to make the decision we would have made regardless if you were in the room or not. This is one of the single most challenging things that I think an executive in particular has to deal with because there are all of those long-standing traditional stereotypes that make it difficult to break through and have meaningful connection and power sharing. And on top of that, we now have this rapidly splintering political dynamic.
And to me, it seems like they're all part of the same picture, right? I mean, earlier in the episode, we're talking about the Revenue Act of 1913. This stuff has been set in place for a long time, and we are now, over 100 years later, colliding against some of the inherent tensions in it, right? So it's like one of the most... What's that?
Oh, no, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, one of the most obvious tensions is, literally in our face when we walk out the front door of the Met. You go into the arches, and you look south, and the name on the theater of the New York City Ballet is David Koch. David Koch gave $100 million to get his name on there. Yeah. And I think it's safe to say that he did that not because he supports the underlying message of these ballets and these humanist ideas and sort of progressive concepts, but because for all intents and purposes now, being a plutocrat like that and giving $100 million in this day and age is the modern equivalent of papal indulgences, right? You're buying good public graces, and you also get a lot of power when you do that. And so obviously the management and the decisions made at City Ballet, and again, it's not just City Ballet, it's organizations all around the country dealing with this basic pressure. Like, you cut $100 million check and you get a lot of say in how things go. And that's a problem when, you know, the governing ideology of that money is fundamentally at odds with either the literal or figurative mission of these institutions. And there's only so much like bridging of that you can do with, like, you know, helpful conversations in boardrooms. You know, we're living in this moment where this stuff is becoming very obvious.
And Drew, I think you hit the nail on the head with a word that you said almost in passing, or words you said in passing, which was power sharing.
Yeah.
That's really what this conversation is about. It's like, who has power, who doesn't have power, and are the people with power willing to share it? You know, in order for things to progress in a meaningful direction, some people with power are going to have to be willing to part ways with some of that power. You know, and that's what you're talking about the idea of like patronizing or tokenizing a handful of people that may end up being on a board. And that's why some places have different levels of boards, right? It's like there's like the general board, and then this part of the board,
the advisory
executive board, and then whatever, you know, it happens to be. And some people have the opportunity for X amount of dollars to state their opinion, and then people for another one have the opportunity to maybe state their opinion in a smaller group, and then another group actually gets to make the final decisions. And oftentimes that's because the final decision makers are the ones who give the most money. But what does it mean about moving people because of other contributions they make or other perspectives they bring to the table higher up into the power structure? Which, you know, I don't claim that there's an easy answer to that, because with most things, if there was an easy answer, someone would have done it already, right? But I think it does require that people with power be willing to give up some of it for us to move forward.
Well, and just tagging on that,
scalable answer. That's what I was going to actually interject with you, Jason. I think Weston made the point, which is, yes, this does come back to power. And when I'm talking about scalable power, there is the Metropolitan Opera, which is this gigantic, at the top of the food chain beast that consumes money.
right?
But it's likely not going to be the pioneer moving into these directions that we're talking about. The folks who are going to be better suited from a governance standpoint my money is on the smaller budget organizations, because they don't have as many of the complicating strings connected to everything that strap it in place.
That's probably true. I mean, something about this is reminding me of a sentiment that I've been hearing among, you know, a lot of our colleagues and just sort of musicians out in the world in general. And everybody be like, oh, you know, we just want things to go back to normal. And I'm going to shamelessly borrow a really excellent line from this Ed Yong piece in The Atlantic. He's been writing a lot about, you know, coronavirus and everything. And he was just like, well, normal led to this. I'm not sure we want to go back to normal. Like that's what got us here. Like, we kind of have to rethink what normal is going to look like, because, you know, we are colliding with some of these very, very fundamental tensions. And, yeah, like, definitely, I think smaller companies are going to be able to adapt, and they're a little more nimble. But I mean, the Met is facing, well, it's just facing the you know, the Met and all these other performing arts institutions are facing the greatest existential shock of their modern existence. And there's going to be a lot of reconfiguring. And so part of what I've been thinking about is, well, you know, as long as we're reconfiguring a bunch of stuff, like, let's tackle this too. Like, let's make sure we could maybe get this part a little bit better figured out.
You want to throw a collective bargaining agreement in at the same time? Because it sounds way too easy right now.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I understand your perspective that smaller organizations or more pioneering organizations, whatever you want to call them, are going to possibly have the opportunity to be more flexible. But I also think for organizations that already have a really large institutional footprint in their ecosystem, there's, given the appropriate leadership style and the appropriate sense of values, there's a great opportunity to do something truly amazing in a way that smaller organizations could never do.
Absolutely.
You know, I mean, what
Absolutely.
if you take an organization, and since we're using the Met as an example, that has for many years had an operating budget of $300 million a year, and say, when we come back and we're doing our work with a budget like that or similar to that or whatever, even if it's only 2/3 of that, whatever it happens to be in the post-COVID era, we're going to channel those resources to do something where we come back, but we're inclusive of everyone. That would be incredibly powerful. And that's something that smaller organizations would take them decades to achieve. So even though I think we can look at the past of organizations and say, hey, look, these big ships take a long time to turn, there is an opportunity to do something different and do it quickly. I think a lot of what COVID and the Black Lives Matter movement has done has forced a lot of organizations, both large and small, to accelerate a lot of things. You know, and being an administrator at Juilliard, if you had told us a full calendar year ago, we need you to build online programming, okay, I imagine that discussion would have taken a long time, and there would have been a very long runway to ramping up to try to get it figured out. It may have taken several years. But March rolled around, and within 2 or 3 weeks, the whole school had shifted, bang, and now we're doing online school. Everyone's in Zoom. Teachers are scrambling and figuring out new ways to engage with students in really meaningful ways. And you're figuring out a lot of things en route, but a lot of really good work is being done. And now there are all these new and creative ways of thinking about how to provide an education to students. And it's happened almost, I mean, if you think in the big picture over how long institutions like this have existed, in that scope, it's happened almost overnight.
I think that's an awesome point. And I'm thinking about that, reflecting back on like some of the issues with opera companies. And, you know, to your point, Weston and Drew, right? Like big and small companies navigate these things differently. But you think back to when the Met Opera did The Death of Klinghoffer back in 2014. There was no performing arts institution that had more resources to get this right. And yet, if anyone remembers, that was a fairly spectacular debacle for how the Met handled that. And I look at that and I think it says a few things. Like, it is challenging to mount political operas, but other companies have done it. And so what this says is that it's surely a reflection of values and priorities. And if you have your priorities and your values figured out, like Juilliard, you can turn on a dime and figure out, okay, now we're doing online teaching now. Or if you're the Met Opera and you have your priorities and values aligned, then it's like, okay, well, we're going to mount this opera that is complicated and potentially divisive. I mean, we're going to do so in a smart way that engages our community. And other people have done it too. Like, it can be done. And it kind of says everything about the internal dynamics of the institution and who's making those decisions.
It's a great place to end it. I think this is for a little after segment, for the little dessert. I think this is good. I think looking back at it, Jason, you win the Jargon Award for working the phrase papal indulgencies into a sentence.
I'm always talking about, like, you know, the weirdness of Catholicism anytime I can. So
it's just natural now.
Yeah, right.
It wasn't even like you tried. It just was there. Yeah, and of course, yes, obviously. Well, again, thank you guys both very much for taking the time for this. And I hope everybody enjoyed it as much as hopefully everybody here enjoyed sitting around talking about it. And I am sure we're going to have both of you back, either together, different people, but we'll find some way to get everyone around again, because this was really a lot of fun.
Cool. Thanks for having us.
I'm always down to nerd out. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.